All right, so welcome everyone to the Center for Living and our special event with award-winning poet John Brehm titled In the Thick of It. Thank you so much for joining us. If we haven't met, or if I haven't met you, my name is Michelle Bledsoe, and I'm a meditation teacher here at the center, along with my dear friend Bob Stout. And our role this evening will be to help navigate our time together. We also have Mo, our community manager, and Emily, our Zoom specialist, helping out. And the Center for Mindful Living's head teacher and founder, Hugh Byrne, will be joining John in discussion later on. So we are well supported this evening. Our evening is full. We have a lot planned, so we want to dive in. And I'll go over our format of our time together. John will give a talk. He'll then have a discussion with Hugh. And then John will guide us in a meditation. Then he'll lead a poetry discussion. And then if there's time, Q&A. So again, we are really excited and so grateful that John could join us this evening. John's book, The Dharma of Poetry, How Poems Can Deepen Your Spiritual Practice and Open You to Joy, is a gem of a book right here. It's about how poems teach us to befriend a cricket or stop on a snowing evening to take a pause. It is the extraordinary moments that become extraordinary because we stopped and we started to live fully the felt sense of the interconnectedness that is here now. And I'm grateful that he taught me this again in both his book and in conversing with him, how we can embody that time and time again.
Oh, yeah. That's Michelle.
This ordinary moment, then ordinary moments become extraordinary, full of life. And remember this, the poet seems to say, remember this humble yet so profound truth of how we're all interconnected. And so while I would love to go on, we do have a few more things to go over so we can enjoy our time with John. I'll pass it over to Bob for some logistics.
Thank you, Michelle. Very quickly, because I want to get you right to John. But just so you know, the event is being recorded. Some of you may have already clicked on recognizing that because we have a number of people who could not be here and would like to watch it. And so we will be recording it and showing it on our YouTube channel for the Center for Mindful Living. Later on, there will be a poetry discussion and some Q&A. And so if you raise your hand to make a comment, we will not see your face, but your voice would be heard in the recording. And if you'd rather that not be the case, you can feel free to put your comment or question in the chat. So we'll be keeping an eye on that. And on the chat feature to reduce distractions, the discussion with Hugh and meditation, you only be able to chat to the hosts and co-hosts, just so you know. And so with that, it's my very distinct pleasure and honor to introduce and turn you over to John Brehm.
Thank you so much, Bob and Michelle and everyone for coming to the event. I'm honored and delighted to be here with you today and to talk about some poems and do some practice together and just explore the richness of this intersection between poetry and the Dharma. And I know your Sangha is already steeped in poetry and Dharma. I'm excited to explore this further. I wonder, because there's some people whose mics are picking up, I wonder, can you just mute all the participants? Just so
Oops. Okay, and we muted you too, John. Sorry.
I said everyone but me. Yeah, so I'm just delighted to be here with you and looking forward to especially to getting into some poems together and exploring them and seeing how much we can discuss them together. It's a little tricky with a large group, but we'll make the best of it. I also want to say right at the beginning that, you know, I'm sure for many of us, all of us, our hearts are heavy for all those who are suffering in Los Angeles, the fires. I think, you know, I'm on the West Coast, and most of the people I know have friends or family there. I have some family there. They're safe, but just want to acknowledge that that's in our field. That's in our kind of energetic relational field right now. So I just want to acknowledge that and know
Each
that,
time it says,
we're feeling that. Yeah. So
wait,
all right.
wait a minute.
So I want to give a short talk about reverence. And when I was putting together this new anthology, The Poetry of Grief, Gratitude, and Reverence, I was quite confident in my first two choices for themes, grief and gratitude. Those felt just immediately right and resonant. And I had a lot of poems already in mind for those sections. Reverence was a little trickier. I had some hesitation, some uncertainty about that. Reverence is not a word that we encounter very often these days. And when we do, it's typically in a Christian rather than a Buddhist context. And it has a kind of, I feel like there's a kind of darkly Gothic church-like association with that word, which I'm trying to free it from. But it kept kind of insisting on its presence. And the more I felt into it, the more it seemed not just appropriate to include, but really essential. And as the sort of culmination of this emotional trajectory from grief to gratitude to reverence, the sort of crowning emotional field that the poems lead up to in the book. And so I've come to feel it's just vitally important, not just for poems and for spiritual practice, but for our ability to find a new way of living that is more sane and more sustainable and more in line with our true nature. So even as I say, we think of reverence primarily in a Christian context. We also, every time we bow in our Buddhist practice, every time we do prostrations, we are embodying the spirit of reverence, of humility and reverence. And so, it's infused in Buddhist practice as well. And the Zen teacher, John Blofeld, says that a spirit of reverence is essential to successful practice. Without it, enlightenment can never be attained. Without it, enlightenment can never be attained. So it's strongly present for those of us who are Buddhist practitioners on the path as well. So I wanted to start with a definition of reverence. It comes from a Latin word, reverentia, which literally means to stand in awe of. To stand in awe of. And I've always been struck by the postural specification there, that it's not simply a feeling that we have in any configuration, but we stand in awe. When we feel reverent, we stand in awe. It's a kind of respectfulness and alertness that is implied by standing in awe. And I would also say that reverence is informed by these kind of tributary emotions of wonder, of respect, of humility, that those are contributors to the full expression of reverence. We'll maybe see that more clearly when we get into the poems. Another way to understand reverence is to think about its opposite, its antonym. So we might be tempted to think that irreverence is the opposite of reverence, but that's not quite right. The true opposite of reverence is arrogance. The feeling of self-importance, of pridefulness, a kind of disrespectfulness, a sort of narcissism, the feeling of being able to do whatever we want without consequence. And that kind of arrogance, I think, you probably can immediately feel how that has damaged our world, and how it is driving us as a culture, as a species, towards the abyss. And, there are very particular embodiments of arrogance, and I won't name names. I think that's probably necessary, but you can see it. It's so vivid, this quality of arrogance. It's hard to imagine certain people bowing. And then, of course, we have our own arrogance, of which we are, largely unconscious. When we start to look and really examine, we see that, oh yes, I too, I put myself first always. I want what I want, and I want it the way I want it, and I think I'm entitled to that. We all feel some degree of that, which is partly why we practice, to get beyond that self-centeredness, that quality of arrogance. One of the few recent books on arrogance is called Reverence, Renewing a Forgotten Virtue. Renewing a Forgotten Virtue. And this idea that we have largely forgotten reverence is one I'd like to explore more fully in our time together today. But I think, in this, as in so many aspects of spiritual practice, it's not so much about learning something new, discovering something new, as remembering what we have always known but have forgotten, or have been encouraged to forget. And so that interplay of forgetfulness and remembering, I think, is really important. And I know, Michelle, you mentioned that in your introduction, and I was pleased to hear you land on that word with a particular kind of emphasis of remembering. And I think that's true. But then we have to ask, so why have we forgotten? Why have we forgotten the feeling of reverence? Why would that be something that, a feeling that is kind of, I think, deeply interfused into our spiritual DNA, our spiritual ancestry? What has happened to make us lose contact with that quality of reverence? And there's a lot of ways to answer that question. One way is to see reverence as a casualty of modernity. That is, as a casualty of our modern, industrial, technological, disenchanted civilization. Feeling of reverence has been banished from that world. And I think the reason for that is that reverence is fundamentally incompatible with modernity, with the underlying assumptions of modernity, in part because modernity has desacralized the earth and is driven by sort of unchecked exploitation of the earth. And you can't revere the earth and exploit it at the same time. And so something has to give. And what has given is this quality of reverence, the sense that the earth is sacred. That has to be banished for full-scale resource extraction and exploitation to proceed. So we have to suppress or forget the sacredness of life. And we do that, and yet we can't escape the feeling of what we have lost, the sense of being disconnected from the sacred. Even if we're not consciously aware of that, I think we feel it. It's like we're haunted by it. It's like a phantom limb. It's not there, but it used to be. And on some deep unconscious level, we feel that. We feel the loss of that deep interconnectedness, as you mentioned, Michelle, and the sacredness of our connection to the earth, the feeling that we are enmeshed in this web of life, that we're never not in relationship to it. And so we carry that wound, I think, and it may explain, much of the emotional turmoil, the depression, the sense of purposelessness, the quality of just feeling lost, because that's our birthright, to feel a sacred connection with the earth. And when it's gone, we feel profoundly incomplete. So, our culture kind of demands that we live as if that's not true, as if there is no sacredness in the earth, in our life, and that we have to accept the unexamined assumption that life is just a meaningless accident of conditions, of material conditions. And that this hyper-rationalist scientific worldview that we have adopted represents an advance over our more animistic Paleolithic ancestors, who felt deeply that all of life was sacred, all of life was imbued with spirit. Rivers had spirits, mountains had spirits, trees had spirits, and they were all worthy of our respect and reverence. But that's a worldview that we have banished, and we try to convince ourselves that we're better off having done so. But I think the evidence that that's not the case is all around us, all too vividly. And what results from that, I believe, is a kind of arrogance that sees humans as fundamentally different from and superior to all other life forms, that we are set apart and above all other life forms. And this arrogance is right at the heart of the ecological devastation that we're seeing all around us. So I think the stakes are very high for how we work with this feeling of reverence and how we might be able to bring it more into a more central place in our lives again. I would also say in that regard that I think reverence is a culturally subversive practice. That is, by cultivating reverence, we are going against the grain of our culture, of our desacralized culture that is so profoundly materialist that we hardly stop to question it anymore. So I'm reading a wonderful book right now called Hospicing Modernity. And it's by a terrific writer named Vanessa Machado de Oliveira. And she is a person who has an indigenous background and also European ancestry. But one of the things she says in this very striking book is that modernity is a denial of relationship and an atrophy of the senses. Modernity is a denial of relationship and an atrophy of the senses. And that speaks to the sense of fragmentation, separation that we feel, the loss of relationship, the idea that separate things are more important than the relationships between them, which is exactly backwards. And more interestingly, that our senses have atrophied. And that's something I had never fully considered before, but I think it's quite true that as our culture becomes more abstract, we become more cut off, screened off from our immediate sensual connection to the physical, the actual physical world, and not the world of screens and the virtual world, but the real world. I'm always struck, and this is hardly needs to be said, it's cliche, but just how many people are lost in their phones in public places. It's astonishing. And she tells a story about finding a wounded hummingbird and carrying it on the campus where she teaches, and while she's carrying it, the hummingbird is kind of coming back to life, and it was in a state of torpor, rather, not wounded, but it's rehearsing its flight. It's trying to kind of get its wings back, And she's just in awe of this, and she's amazed, and she's walking through this crowd of students, coming by her, and she wanted them all to see it. She wanted them all to kind of experience the joy and wonder that she was feeling, and not a single person noticed. Not a single person observed this miracle, because they were lost in their own minds. They were lost in their own thoughts, in their own preoccupations, and in their own phones, probably. And that seems to me a very vivid kind of example of where we are and where we're headed as a culture. And I want to talk about reverence in relationship to the mind. And there's no room for reverence in a crowded mind. If the mind is crowded, if there is this incessant proliferation of thought, there's no space for reverence to arrive. Reverence requires stillness and silence and spaciousness in order to manifest. And those qualities are incompatible with the thinking mind, the mind that is just immersed in one train of thought, one self-centered train of thought after another. These mental proliferations that we have become addicted to and that are so tormenting for us. So meditation as a practice can begin to shift. And I'm sure you've experienced this, you're all meditators, that, when we start to establish a quality of spaciousness in the mind, silence, stillness, we feel that these deeper emotions of reverence, of compassion, of loving kindness can begin to emerge because there's space for them. But we have to create that space, because the mind left to its own devices gets very crowded and very unstable and very unable to host these deeper feelings of reverence and compassion and loving kindness. So even if we don't feel reverent when we meditate, we're creating the conditions for reverence to arise. I'm also reading a wonderful book by Tenzin Wangyal Rinpoche, who says, when you are connected to stillness, silence, and spaciousness, anything you perceive can be experienced directly and vividly, because the judging mind is not occupying the space. When the judging mind is silent, there's spaciousness can emerge, and we can perceive things directly, unmediated. There's kind of naked awareness that comes into play. So the Pali word, as I'm sure many of you know, sati, is usually translated as mindfulness, but it also carries the sense of remembering, of recollecting. And I'm struck by, again, this quality of remembering, how important that is. Not discovering something new, not learning something that we didn't know how to do already, but just remembering. And so when we're mindful, we remember to come back to the present moment, to the aliveness of the present moment, to our immediate, intimate experience with life just as it is right now. And I think that can help restore a sense of our ability to be sensually engaged with the world, that it can revitalize some of the senses that have become atrophied, as de Oliveira says. And I would say that being present is a necessary precondition for reverence. You can't feel reverence if we're not already present, if we're not with our life just as it is, not wishing it to be otherwise, not thinking about it, but actually experiencing it. And I would also argue that poetry can restore us to a more embodied, intuitive, empathic, compassionate, imaginative way of engaging with our experience in the world. When poems are approached in the right spirit, and for me, that means when they're approached in an appreciative mode rather than an analytical mode, they can release us from grasping and aversion. They can liberate us from the need to fix and control, from the desire for certainty, for clarity. They can let us explore ambiguity and irony and subtlety and emotional undercurrents and all these much deeper and obviously more right brain feelings. Poetry can be a conduit for those feelings and can help us to cultivate them in our own lives. So I think in that way, poetry and meditation can work together really beautifully to create a space where stillness, openness, awareness can arise, and that poetry can support that by giving us a more embodied experience. And partly because not all poems, but certainly the poems we're going to look at today, poets give us the example of immersing in the texture of life, the aliveness of our experience, our immediate, unmediated experience. And so I think we'll see that, very strongly when we start to look at the poems together. But poems they're remarkable things, beings, I want to call them. There's a wonderful writer, Ian McGilchrist, who argues that works of art are experienced as being more like people than like things. And that seems to me quite true. I think of poems as being living beings, as these embodiments of consciousness, the consciousness of the poet, that we can enter with our own consciousness. And there's a kind of alchemy that occurs when that happens that's just extraordinary. But poems, unlike, other forms of language, are more embodied. That is, they bring us into a more sensual way of being with the language, where we're paying attention to the sound and texture of language, not just what the words mean, but the physical quality, the materiality of language, you might say. We're paying attention to that. We're feeling that, the music, the rhythm, the texture, the subtleties, the tonal shifts, all those things are vitally important in poems. They are in all writing, but much more so in poems, I believe. So this sense of restoring a quality of spaciousness, of connectedness, that can give rise to reverence. I think poetry and meditation both play a vital role. And when they're brought together, they kind of supercharge each other, I feel. And I hope that we'll see that today. And I think there's great potential for healing the collective consciousness. And that's where I feel the change has to happen. I mean, we can come up with technological fixes to the climate crisis. It's not going to help if we keep living the same way we're living from the same kind of consciousness that created the problems in the first place, as Einstein said. And I want to just close before Hugh and I begin to have a conversation with a quote from a Sufi teacher, some of you may know, Llewellyn Vaughan Lee. And he says, "The world is not a problem to be solved. It is a living being to which we belong. The world is part of our own self, and we are part of its suffering wholeness. Until we go to the root of our image of separateness, there can be no healing. And the deepest part of our separateness from creation lies in our forgetfulness of its sacred nature, which is also our own sacred nature." And I think there again, it's the forgetfulness of our sacred nature. The sacred nature of the world, which is the same as our own sacred nature. So the project is to remember these essential truths that we have been encouraged to forget by our cultural conditioning and other factors. So I'll leave it there, and then looking forward to talking with Hugh about this and anything else that comes up. So thank you for listening.
Thank you, John. What a beautiful talk, and I feel reverence and filled with awe. And I also hear so many threads that I think Hugh may want to pull that are so familiar in his teaching. So it's my privilege here to briefly introduce Hugh to those of you who don't know him. He is the lead teacher of our Sangha, our community. He's been teaching Buddhist meditation, I think, for 25 years. But he also, when you talk, John, about going against the grain of our culture, Hugh is a lifelong social activist, building on a background, a law degree, as well as a poli-sci degree, and just beautifully brings the idea of Buddhist engagement and what it means to live in this world. And he's been my teacher, and I'm now learning and being a teacher thanks to Hugh. And one of the amazing things about Hugh is the way that he uses poetry in his teaching. He's brought that to me, he's brought that to all of us. So there's such a natural affinity between the two of you in that regard. And I wanted to mention, as you know, John, Hugh teaches a course that's available on the Insight Timer app on that very topic. And so I'm just so excited that you two are together, and invite you to have a conversation with us. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Bob.
Thank you, Bob, for your very, very, very kind words. And thank you, Michelle, and thank you, everyone, for organizing this wonderful evening. And thank you, of course, John. It feels such a privilege to have you here. I've been, I'm aware of your work, and but in preparation for this session, kind of immersing myself further, particularly in the Dharma of poetry, which I think is such a beautiful, beautiful book. So I feel very much, like all of us, I think, sitting at your feet, kind of getting your wisdom and your kindness. And it feels really a privilege to have you here. And so I just want to thank you for that. And
oh, thank you. I'm delighted, and again, honored to be here. So thank you. Yeah.
Thank you, John. And there's so many kind of different ways in. I could imagine like 50 different ways in. So I want to kind of bring it perhaps to a meta level with one T rather than two, the kind of big picture, stepping up into the kind of Dharma and poetry. As I was thinking about this kind of talk, sharing and discussion and the session as a whole, what came to mind for me was this relationship of Dharma and poetry as a marriage made in heaven, that phrase, it's kind of, there's something about how they fit together for me. And I'm, as I mentioned, I think to you before, I'm more an appreciator rather than a writer of poetry, although I've done a little bit of that. And what I'd like to kind of reflect on, invite you to reflect on mainly is just, this connection of, Dharma teachings, Dharma practices on one hand, and poetry, on the other, are side by side. It seems that they're both pointing to something, that there's the teaching, the Dharma teachings, they're never something solid that, I could just hand them to you and you'd kind of like, you'd have the teachings. Even the wisest and most compassionate teaching is always just the finger pointing at the moon, as they say in the Zen tradition. And I think poetry potentially has that same kind of potential to point the finger, point to the truth, point to the Dharma, and to, in a sense, point back to ourselves, point to, what I think you talk about and what you've already somewhat talked about, what we already know and perhaps have forgotten and have been caught up in habit patterns and disconnected from ourselves, as you talked about, disconnected from the world, from our life in so many different ways, and that poetry can kind of bring us back, into that immediacy, and just having that as an entry point, and invite you to kind of reflect in any way, would be helpful, you might find helpful to share some reflections on, the power of poetry and how, and I'm obviously talking here about not every poem, but what you might call great poems or spiritual poems or Dharma poems, and just, anything you'd like to share around some of those reflections.
Yeah, thanks, Hugh. I mean, you're pointing to some really essential, aspects of poetry and Dharma. I have come to feel that poetry's highest purpose is to remind us of our true nature, to bring us back to who we really are. And, I think it elicits a deeply empathic, imaginative, intuitive, playful, subtle, sensitive way of being. When we read poems in that way, when we are attuned to the subtleties of poetry, to those aspects of poems that elicit our intuitive response, the sense that we don't always know, we can't translate a poem into prose, but we can feel intuitively what the poem is communicating to us. And the writer I mentioned who said that our senses have atrophied, you could also say that our ability to be empathic has atrophied, that our empathy, our compassion, our loving kindness have been under assault in a way. And those qualities flourish in poems. And we can sense that, we can feel it. And I think, for me, when I read poems that have those qualities, I don't just put the poem down and then, go back to being, a selfish, self-obsessed, oblivious person, although of course we all fall back into that. But it makes me want to live my life differently. It makes me want to look at the world, to stop, again, as you said, Michelle, to pause, to experience, to be with the immediacy and aliveness of the moment. And so I think poems really can help us live our lives. And for me, my parents grew up very poor in the Depression in Nebraska, and they were able to kind of establish a middle-class life, but their lives were really consumed with practical matters, understandably. But I wanted something different. When I discovered poetry, I thought, this is it. This is where I want to live. This is where I feel most fully alive and feel like who I really am. I being immersed in the world of practicalities just didn't hold much interest for me. So I don't feel like I'm probably answering the question very well, but Dharma, broadly defined as the truth of things, I think poetry does indeed point us to that and helps us experience it in a more embodied way. And I think that is part of its unique power.
Thank you, John. There's I'm just going to reflect on a reflection of yours. You speak in the Dharma of poetry about poems can help us see and feel the beauty and magic of the world when we allow ourselves to hit pause on our habitual behaviors and thoughts. And you talk about probably needing poetry now more than ever in the kind of crisis that we're in the middle of. The great poems are needed more than ever as we get more removed from natural processes. And I like, this is in prose, but it feels very poetic to me what you say. A great poem can stop that momentum, you know, of reactivity of the mind for a moment and help us see that any moment fully experienced is a gateway out of the realm of time and change into timeless awareness. And it doesn't have to be, you know, you talk, it doesn't have to be a special moment or a transcendent moment. And what I love about, your poetry and your engagement is that the ordinary, you know, the love of the ordinary. I think you talked about that in a podcast recently, that just, you know, seeing ordinary things and can you talk a little bit about, the poetry is accessible to us everywhere, you know, that in terms of how we're looking at anything, really, if we can kind of look at things with new eyes, perhaps, you know, rather than seeing them in a habitual way. Oh, this is this, and I use it for this. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I think that's really true. Poems can arise from any circumstance. It's not so much, you know, what we see, but how we see. And so if we're attuned to these more subtle beauties and things that we might not think of as being beautiful or evocative, that's where the magic really arises. Because, you know, we can all be wowed by a mountain range or the ocean or, you know, or Douglas fir tree that's 400 years old. But it's these subtle things that can, I think, elicit in a way a stronger response. You know, I've been reading and a lot of haiku lately and writing haiku, and of course that's a tremendous Zen practice of being with the moment and being with it in this very immediate, intimate way. And it doesn't have to be a big moment. And, you know, I included these 4 haiku in the packet by a wonderful poet, Christopher Harold, who I met recently up in Port Townsend. But he's just so great. I thought maybe I'll just read a couple of these to give us, you know, a concrete example. Maybe I'll read them all since they're short. Planting stones in the dry stream bed, clouds gather. And oh my gosh, I'm sorry, there's a typo there. It should be stream bed. Planting stones in the dry stream bed, clouds gather. Like the relationship between those two things is just implied, but it seems like somehow planting the stones causes the clouds to gather. There's this kind of mirroring. And then my favorite one is the last one. Just a minnow, the granite mountain wobbles on the lake. It's just your mind gets big, you know, right? The moment gets big from this very small observation. Or vegetable garden, 1,000 weeds, 1,000 apologies. Pulling the weeds and apologizing. Shovel handle, dark with earth from my hands. There's a quality of just this, just this. That's all that's needed. We don't need to provide a lot of commentary, a lot of mental proliferation about what this means. It's just the moment. So yeah, I think poems can help us attune to these more subtle qualities of beauty, and we can begin to see that the ordinary always has within it the possibility of the extraordinary, and it just depends on how we look at it, and that can be a practice, and I think it's a very fruitful one for us spiritually, emotionally, culturally. So yeah.
I think of Basho's poem, the old pond, a frog jumps in, plop. That's Alan Watts' translation, my favorite of the many translations of that poem. That kind of it brings to me that quality of that relationship between the Dharma, that presence, that opening, and I think one of my favorite poems, I'm sure you'll know it well, is Li Po's "The birds have vanished into the sky, and now the last cloud drains away. We sit together, the mountain and me, until only the mountain remains." And there's a sense of, for me, that's kind of like, I can't not drop into that kind of place of,
Yeah.
I can just be here in that space, and then everything else kind of fades away. And the power of poetry in that way. One of the things I got from my early education, just fortunately, was an encouragement to learn poetry by heart. And I still remember many of the poems from my, early teenage years. I can still recite lots of them, and Julius Caesar in various plays, etc. But there's something about, I was thinking of learning by heart, where we take them into our hearts, and they're available to us. We don't need to, where did I put that? And I wonder, does that have is that something that you love, or
I do. I love I think it's a beautiful practice. I haven't done a lot of that myself, although some of the poems that I love most, I've read so many times that I've memorized them without even trying to, which is wonderful. As someone, I think a biographer of Robert Frost said, it's hard not to memorize his poems if you read them enough. So they're in me. They're definitely in me. I tend to, my practice is when I find a poem I love, I will read it again and again and again and again. I mean, literally hundreds of times. So I feel like I'm absorbing it. And I may not be able to recite it perfectly, but it's deeply in there. And I think that's really important, to stay with a poem. When you find a poem a lot that you really love, stay with it. I mean, you'll see more, you'll feel more, it will become part of you. And I think that's what happens when you memorize poems, when you learn them by heart, as you say, which is a wonderful metaphor. And yeah, the Li Po poem, I mean, it's the self drops away, the ego disappears, and you're just with that. Only the mountain remains. And that's tremendously liberating when we can be free, even for a moment, from the egoic mind that kind of runs us ragged. And poetry is a doorway. It's a portal into that realm. And I think that can be very healing. Yeah.
Thank you, John. I think maybe we can check in and with Michelle and Bob, and just see. I know we're a little over in terms of time. If you want to guide us into the next, give us some guidance on time.
Yeah, I think, we are. I think it's for John, maybe step into a meditation now.
Yeah. But we're running a little behind on time. Is I got that right?
Yeah, about 10 minutes, but yeah.
Oh, okay. All right. So let's do just a brief sitting practice. And then, so I'll guide you, just some minimal guidance. And then while we're still sitting, I'll read the first poem in the packet that I sent out and that I hope you have, and that we'll screen share. And then we'll have some discussion. And we may just get to a couple poems. We don't have a lot of time, but I think that will be a rich experience. So you're all meditators, so go ahead and find your meditation posture, that posture of that supportive of an upright alertness, quality of dignity, maybe even nobility and respectfulness. And if it's comfortable to let the eyes close, go ahead and let the eyes close. And if you prefer to keep them open, that's fine too, just a kind of soft downward gaze. And just beginning to feel how it is just to be sitting here right now, in this moment, in this space, in this body. bringing attention to those places of touch, of contact, feeling the feet on the floor, maybe a sense of tingling or vibration in the feet. And we're all in buildings, but maybe even a feeling of contact with the earth itself is coming through. And we feel it in the feet or in the seat, whatever's on the ground for you most fully. Feeling the support of the chair or the cushion. Sensing the weight of the body, a sense of warmth. Letting the attention drop down and into the body. We're so typically up in our heads and our attention is out in the world, outside of us. We turn inward and let it drop. And sense the body from the inside. Letting the shoulders drop, let the shoulders relax, let the face be soft, and the eyes be soft. Letting go of any obvious tension in the body. Just the feeling of I'm here. I'm right here. In the aliveness of this moment. And I know that I'm here. Feeling the breath coming in and flowing out. Maybe a little cooler coming in and warmer in the exhalation from the circuit it has made inside the warmth of the body. And just resting in awareness, open, spacious awareness. Noticing sensations as they arise and last for a while and pass away. And now I'll read this poem by Robinson Jeffers called A Return. A little too abstract, a little too wise, It is time for us to kiss the earth again. It is time to let the leaves rain from the skies. Let the rich life run to the roots again. I will go to the lovely Sur rivers and dip my arms in them up to the shoulders. I will find my accounting where the alder leaf quivers in the ocean wind over the river boulders. I will touch things and no more thoughts that breed like mouthless mayflies darkening the sky, the insect clouds that blind our passionate hawks so that they cannot strike, hardly can fly. Things are the hawk's food, and noble is the mountain, O noble Pico Blanco, steep sea wave of marble. Yeah, and as you're ready, just let your eyes gently open. And now we'll move into responding to the poem. And wonderful, we've got a screen share of it. It's not quite, you could scroll down a little bit. Just, yeah, there we go. Perfect. Yeah, great. I'll read it again. It's wonderful to hear the poems in meditation, but I'll just read it again so we can begin to respond to it. Return. A little too abstract, a little too wise. It is time for us to kiss the earth again. It is time to let the leaves rain from the skies. Let the rich life run to the roots again. I will go to the lovely Sur rivers and dip my arms in them up to the shoulders. I will find my accounting where the alder leaf quivers in the ocean wind over the river boulders. I will touch things and no more thoughts that breed like mouthless mayflies darkening the sky, the insect clouds that blind our passionate hawks so that they cannot strike, hardly can fly. Things are the hawk's food, and noble is the mountain, O noble Pico Blanco, steep sea wave of marble. Yeah, so the way I like to approach poetry and encourage people to approach poetry is just to respond to what you like about the poem. Like what feels lit up, what feels particularly alive, what feels resonant, what do you go towards in the poem? And it might be just a line or a single word or a couple of lines together or a tone of voice. It can really be anything, but we let our appreciation guide us rather than our analytical mind, which is always trying to figure things out. We let that be in the background. So, and I know we have a big group, but if you'd like to offer a comment, just raise your Zoom hand and we'll get to as many as possible. Yeah, what do you like? Yes, Robin. You need to unmute. There
Yeah.
you go.
What occurred to me is something that I had never noticed before with poetry, that I dance, and not quite nearly frequently enough lately, but in the reading, in the cadence of the words, I realized I could feel a waltz in there.
Oh, nice.
There's this sense of movement, embodied movement, that could be found in there when I'm feeling the poem as opposed to thinking the poem.
That's so wonderful. I mean, you're having an embodied response to the poem, and you're bringing your own experience of dance, and that's resonating with the way the poem dances, the way the poem moves, the music of the lines. I mean, it's a very sonically rich poem and rhythmically rich poem. I will go to the lovely Sur rivers and dip my arms in them up to the shoulders. I will find my accounting where the alder leaf quivers in the ocean wind over the river boulders. I mean, yeah, it's a sonnet, so it's rhymed and there's a lovely rhythmic pattern. So that to me is a much richer response than saying, well, I think the poet is saying this. Right? No, just feel it. To feel it in the body is wonderful. So thank you for that. That's beautiful. Yeah, Patty.
So for me, the piece that hits me the most is I'll go to the lovely Sir Rivers and dip my arms into them up to the shoulders. I just can picture doing that and the feeling of just being one with nature and being in it. It's beautiful.
Yeah, that's my favorite part of the poem as well. That immersion in the real world. I will dip my. I'm not just gonna, let my hand, kind of on the surface of the water. No, I'm going to dip my arms in them up to the shoulders, like as far as I can go. Um, and that's, I think, recovering the the central engagement with the world. The poem, embodies that for us. It shows us that, and then, as you say, we can feel it, right? I mean, we see it, we see him doing it, but there's a way in which we're doing it also. We feel it. And that's the richness of the poem. It allows us to participate in this immersive experience. So yeah, that's wonderful. Thanks for pointing to that. Yeah. Yes, Mo.
I think one thing I really enjoy about this poem, and maybe just poetry at large, is how different it feels when I first read it, and then when I read it once again, and then when I read it once again. Like at first it was just like hearing the sounds, and then the second time around, first time around, I wasn't necessarily like making the cohesive meaning, which I know
Mhm.
beauty to that. Second time around, I realized that the poet was saying that the thoughts are blinding our passionate hawks so that they cannot strike, hardly can fly. I didn't even make the connection at first that the thoughts were what was coming in and blinding our passionate hawks so that they cannot strike, hardly can fly. And I found that very evocative, because does that not describe the feeling of what it's like to be like weighed down by, to your point, maybe something that is a little bit more absorbed with the self? It's blinding something, it's making that more true nature of the soul not able to strike, not hardly can fly. Like the words hardly can fly to me just really
Yeah.
yeah, strikes a chord. So I really appreciate this poem.
Yeah, yeah, that's wonderful. Yeah, I mean, it is a very sensual, immersive poem, but he's also saying something. I will touch things and no more thoughts that breed like mouthless mayflies darkening the sky, the insect clouds that blind our passionate hawks so that they cannot strike, hardly can fly. And this is what our minds are like, when we're at the mercy of this proliferation of thoughts. It blinds us to the immediacy of our experience, to the aliveness of the moment. And this is why we practice. I mean, we want to be free of that. We want to have some space in the mind, some quiet, some spaciousness, so that we can see clearly, so that we're not blinded. Yeah, no, that's really important. It's really important. And he says it beautifully, right? I mean, it's so memorable the way he says it. And to your point, I mean, I think, yeah, we want to read poems again and again. They don't offer themselves up completely at first glance. It takes a deeper kind of seeing. And so I'm glad you brought that in. Thank you. Yeah, Robert.
I was going to go to the line that you just read, which is that I will touch things and no more thoughts. And what I love about this is that's the turning line in the sonnet. And there is a simplicity to this that isn't as lyrical, it isn't image based like the rest of the poem. And so he's getting to the thing he wants to express, and he does it in a way that could have been from the Tao Te Ching. It's so straightforward. It's so concrete,
Yeah.
and every other line in this poem is a lovely image, but not that line, which is where he delivers his theme, and I think that's beautifully done and well executed.
Yeah, very skillfully done. So sonnets typically have a turning, a volta is the term in Italian, where there's a turn towards a resolution, and Robert is pointing to that. I will touch things and no more thoughts. Yeah, that's really it's really powerful. It reminds me of something a Buddhist teacher, Andrew Olendzki, said. As the senses fill up, the mind empties out. As the senses fill up, the mind empties out. And that seems to me such a pithy teaching. If we're really paying attention to our sense experience in meditation or in nature or whatever, the mind gets quiet. And the reverse is also true. When the mind is agitated, we lose contact with the immediacy of our experience. Yeah, I think the poem speaks really profoundly to those things, and I think they're really important. And it is this wonderful mix of these vivid images and then a couple of statements that bring it all together. I will find my accounting where the alder leaf quivers. A really interesting, beautiful line. And that ending, things are the hawk's food and noble is the mountain. Oh, noble Pico Blanco, steep sea wave of marble. I feel like there's a bow there, like that's reverence. And it's that second, oh, noble Pico Blanco. Noble is the mountain, oh, noble Pico Blanco. Deep respect, humility, awe, wonder. It's all there. It's just so, so beautiful. Yeah, yeah. Yeah, I love this poem. Yeah. Well, maybe, we have a lot of poems. We obviously are not going to get to all of them. But let's do the next one. This is by Danusha Lamaris, another California poet. Actually, Robinson Jeffers was a California poet. This is called Barefoot. I learned the world through the bottoms of my feet, bare in the creeks of summer, stepping on pebbles, the squidge of moss between my toes. On hot asphalt, the hop and skip over cracks, feet already toughened by bramble, dirt, the prickly ground of pine needles. Calloused and ready to roam the rough halls of July, of August, of early September, through acres of blackberry and bristled fountain grass, the spiny clumps of cockleburr and foxtail, through clusters of quartz, agate, feldspar. Small black ants crawled over my toes, fish nibbled at them in the skinny creek. It wasn't summer until I'd been bitten, ankles pocked with the raised bumps left by mosquitoes, flea bites from Toof Toof the cat, who liked to roam the field, then settle back on the shag rug where I'd sink my toes into the plush pile before rambling down to the beach, the fine ground sand, cutting myself on loose shards of grass left by broken beer bottles, sharp-edged shells that dug into the fatted flesh above my instep as I skimmed for washed-up bits of abalone, oysters, clam, sidestepping the glutinous bodies of jellyfish past crusted bulbs of kelp, their long tube stems buzzing with flies. Sometimes the body of a dead seal, the peppered fin curling into itself in the heat. Back on the grassy slope, I'd marvel at how I could feel a gopher stir underground from yards away, that slight rumble in the earth. This was foot knowledge, heel knowledge, knowledge of soul and arch, that domed curve, vaulted nave, everything that entered there, sanctified, holy. Yeah, so there's a lot packed into this poem, and it can feel almost a little overwhelming. There's so much of the world in this poem, but yeah, what stands out as being particularly engaging for you? A line, an image, a moment in the poem, what draws your appreciative attention?
For me, it was the title.
Mm-hmm. What was it about the title? Just the way.
I don't think I looked at the title until I listened to the poem, and then I went back to it. And
Yeah.
yes,
Yeah. Maybe we all remember, going barefoot in the summertime and how that felt, the freedom of that. Something that we mostly don't do very much anymore. Yeah, wonderful. Barefoot knowledge. Yeah, Maura.
Yeah, this definitely reminded me of growing up in New England and walking on the beach without any shoes on. That was just a rite of passage in the summertime and oftentimes in my neighborhood. We just ran around without any shoes on. And this also reminds me of something that, I don't know how true it is or not, but um, when folks talk about the Buddha and then the time we live in now, that there's a sense that, well, maybe it was easier to be mindful back in the Buddhist time because, you walked on foot everywhere and you were in the present moment. You didn't have to worry about your cell phone going off or and that sort of thing. So this idea that, um, yeah, I mean, the fish nibbling and such, it's so reminiscent of my childhood. And when there just really wasn't any concern, it was way back before there were any cell phones or anything else. You just went to the beach, and at some point, it was time to go home.
Right.
And you just kind of hung out at the beach and got like really bored. And that really allowed you to become interested in what was going on around you. And I think sometimes that is the problem in our modern day, that we have so many options. We don't allow ourselves to get bored, creative, and to notice what's going on. So yeah, that's what that brought up for me. So thank you.
Yeah, that's wonderful. Well, you said so much there, but yeah, we're inundated with distractions so that we never have the experience of just being kind of left to our own device, well, not our devices, left to our own, experience of the world and how rich that can be. And, I grew up in Nebraska, so I wasn't near an ocean, obviously. But going barefoot it was a sort of rite of passage because, for the first couple of weeks or so, it was pretty rough. You're walking on gravel roads and stepping on sharp things and getting nicked and cut. And then your feet get calloused and then you're all set. Then you can go anywhere. You can run on pavement and jump over things. And yeah, that freedom has largely disappeared. I mean, kids these days, you could go on a whole rant about that. But I mean, and this is the tragedy of modernity. I mean, it has atrophied our senses, our central engagement with the world. And that's just not a loss of sense contact. It's, as she says, everything that entered through my feet was sanctified, holy. And that's the like, yes, it's not just contact with things, it's the sacredness of the earth entering our bodies because our bodies are making contact with the earth. So yeah, it's such a rich central experience, the poem and what it describes. So yeah, thank you for that. Ellie.
Thank you. I was actually going to say that what really stood out for me was just this sense of interconnection, like between the speaker, between everything that's being experienced, and then how I can relate so much. And it just feels like there's no separation between the earth, the elements, these other creatures, and that being. And because I can relate, it brings me into my interconnection as well. And it's just this sort of awe of being alive and being a part of it all. It was wonderful. So thank you.
Oh, that's so beautifully said. Yeah. The awe of being alive, the sense of no separation. I mean, literally no separation, no shoes to get in the way of contact, but also just a total welcoming of everything. She's not upset that the fish are nibbling at her toes or that she has to step on broken bottles occasionally. It's all there, and she's welcoming it all. She's embracing it all, and that's beautiful. And then your own sense of not being separate from the experience of the poem, and then I think we can have a kind of secondary experience, which is I mean, if we really feel it, it's like we're there. Um, but yes, no separation, a sense of deep interconnectedness, right down to our feet and everything they come into contact with. Yeah, I just love, if you could scroll up a little bit, the sounds, the texture of the language, um, through acres of blackberry and bristled fountain grass, the spiny clumps of cockleburr and foxtail, through clusters of quartz agate feldspar, small black ants crawled over my toes. The sounds are sharp, like the words have sharp sounds. Feldspar, bristled fountain grass, spiny clumps, blackberry. And so the poem is embodying the sharpness of the objects in the language that the poet has chosen very carefully. And so that's another dimension of the poem that's really rich, I think. Yeah. Mhm. Yeah. Mhm. Oh, yes, Lisa.
Sorry, I'm not used to this Zoom. I learned the world through the bottoms of my feet. That is just right there. It's the
Yeah,
poem because feet has knowledge, hands have knowledge, eyes have knowledge, everything has knowledge. So that in itself right there is the poem to me. Just that's those words right there.
that's a great
Okay.
point. I mean, that first line is just so powerful. I learned the world through the bottoms of my feet.
Mm.
Yeah, feet have knowledge, hands have knowledge, our bodies have knowledge. We think, I learned the world because I read a book about it, or I learned the world by thinking about it. But no, I learned it by touching it, by letting it in. Yeah, that's beautiful. Yeah, that first line, it kind of says the whole poem in a way. And then she gives us this wealth of examples to support that. But the first line is what really draws us in. So yeah, thank you for noticing that and speaking to it. Yes, thank you. Yeah, Karen.
Um, Going off of that with the feet at the bottom, the feet are brought into this sacred space by comparing the arch of the feet with domes and vaults and naves,
Yeah,
and
beautiful.
it's like a dissolving of everything into that one sacred space. And because it reminds you of the sacred spaces you've been in, and just the awe that you experience in
Right,
in that kind of when you center into that space.
right. Yeah. Yeah, if you could just scroll down a little bit, just so we can see those last few lines that Karen is pointing to. Yeah, this was foot knowledge, heel knowledge, knowledge of soul and arch, the domed curve, vaulted nave, everything that entered there sanctified, holy. Yeah, I mean, being compared to a cathedral and the sacred space that we feel, the kind of awe that we feel in cathedrals, or we can feel. Um, yeah, and it's unusual, right, to think of the foot as being like a nave or a vaulted, it's a kind of it requires an imaginative leap, which we are able to make because of the skillful way the poet has written it. But yeah, that's a really powerful image there at the end.
John, I wanted to come in really quickly before Krista, just to remind we're about 8 minutes before 8:30, and I'm not saying we need to finish at 8:30 sharp, but I wanted to let folks know if we do run out of time, feel free to put your questions or comments in the chat, and John has very generously offered to take a look at those. And I also wanted to remind you, you'll see there in the chat the opportunity to provide donations or dana to John, and also that buying his books is another great way to support his work. And I know some of us have done that, and I highly commend it. So John, and then I leave it to you after Krista, whether you want. I know you have one of your own poems you were thinking about sharing. Maybe you would want to share that to close us out. Thank you.
Yeah. Thanks for the reminder about the time. I wish we had a couple hours to go in deeply to all these poems. I love it so much, and I love everything you guys are saying about them. So unfortunately, it's a little bit tight on time, but let's proceed for a little while, and then I'll read one of my own poems to close us out. So Krista.
Yeah, I will keep it fairly short. Just what I really appreciated in this poem is kind of how it holds the full range of experience. There's like the coziness of thinking about stepping on moss, but then we all know that pain of stepping onto really, really hot asphalt. And it's also the natural and the human, the broken beer bottle. It's life feeding other life and death. And it's just all of it is held and celebrated and absorbed through the body. And it really just feels like, such a kind of like a love song to the body and how the body, absorbs the world around us.
Yeah. Oh, that's beautiful. A love song to the body and how the body absorbs the world around us. That's beautiful. Yeah, that's exactly what the poem is. It's a poem of praise, of celebration. It's the full embrace. It's the human world with all its problematic features and its life and death, the dead seal. And she doesn't exclude anything. And that's wonderful. It's a very Whitman-esque poem. If you've read much Whitman, you know that he leaves nothing out. He wants to take it all in. And Danusha Lamaris is a very similar kind of poet, very similar sensibility. So I love that. A love song to the body and the way the body is in the world. Yeah. And again, we may not be able to imitate what she's doing here, but it can inspire us to have more contact with the physical world, not to get rid of some of the separation that comes between us and our immediate experience. So thank you so much for that. Forrest.
Yes, I figured out how to raise my hand virtually.
Congratulations.
I really like that, reary feet, rested soul. During the summer, I go barefooted all the time. I love meditating, walking meditation. At a place in Wisconsin, I do walk the Ice Age Trail barefooted.
Yeah.
Really like the first poem when you talked about the leaves, rerooting. Everybody cleans up all their leaves, but that's nutrients for the roots. So that's basically all I want to say. We're short on time.
Yeah. No, thank you for that. You've probably heard of earthing. It's this new kind of movement of encouraging people to get their feet on the ground. My wife is a huge practitioner of that. She'll hike these trails, even in the wintertime, sometimes barefoot, and just loves the sense of contact with the earth. And of course, that's how we lived for hundreds and hundreds of thousands of years. And so it's a way, again, of remembering how close, how intimate we used to be with the earth and how our bodies are designed for that intimacy, for that deep interconnection. So, thank you for that. Well, I said I might read one of my own poems, but now I'm a little reluctant to follow these two great poems. But I wanted to read one before we say goodbye from my book, Dharma Talk. And it is a poem. We decided, Bob and Michelle and I, to label this event "In the Thick of It," and that phrase comes from this poem. And it's a bit of a long poem, so but I'm fine to go over. If you need to leave at 5:30, please don't. I won't be offended much. Okay, this is called Metta, M-E-T-T-A. The book I'm reading suggests we send loving kindness to everyone we see, silently addressing them thus. May you be well, may you be safe, may you be happy. And I do this for a while, sitting inside a cafe, watching the foot traffic go by. It feels good, generous, loving, kind. But after a time, I start modifying the blessing. May you be well, may you be safe, may you be happy, and maybe also lose the frowning into the phone facial expression I get so tired of seeing everywhere I go. It's the shadow side of loving kindness, sticking its nose in, having its say, and I can't seem to shut it up. Someone else walks by and I offer, may you be well, may you be safe, may you be happy. And while you're at it, how about some nicer clothes? It wouldn't kill you to dress with a bit more panache, would it? I keep on in this way, dishing out blessings with a side of helpful advice, until I notice across the room 2 young women sitting side by side, talking quietly, in no need of either my good wishes or my corrective commentary. But then I see that one of them is crying, nodding her head when her friend says something, wiping tears from her cheeks with the palms of her hands. She pulls it together for a while, but then her face clenches and she gives in until her friend lays a hand on her shoulder and she can talk again. A gentle rhythm of crying and talking, waves rising and falling. It doesn't look like she's been visited by tragedy, a sudden death or shattering diagnosis. Ordinary heartbreak would be my guess, the shock of betrayal, some painful reversal in the endless cycle of loss and gain. And now a new emptiness spreads out before her, and she doesn't know what to do. But what kills me is when she tucks her hair behind her ear and tries not to cry, and fails, overcome by this sadness, so that I feel it too. A great swell lifts and carries me and almost pulls me under. And then I'm in the thick of it, wishing her to be well, to be safe, to be happy, as if my life depended on it. So we're exactly at 5:30. How about that? Yeah, so thank you all so much for your attention, for your practice, for your beautiful responses to the poems. It's just been a delight to be with you all, and I'm very grateful. And I wish I could come and visit the center in person. Maybe that will happen someday. It'd be wonderful to be with you all in the same actual space rather than virtual space. So yeah, we didn't have time for questions. I hope that is okay. I'm happy to, as Bob said, answer questions. Or if you just want to, if there are things you wanted to say about the poems, not a question, but just an observation or something that you really loved about a poem that you want to express, I would love to hear that as well. So yeah, whatever you feel like communicating, I'm willing and able to receive.